The thunder crackled across the dark Texas sky as Pearl Lawson clutched her worn leather satchel and stepped off the stagecoach into the muddy main street of El Paso. Her hands trembled not from the cold spring rain that pelted her face, but from the fear of starting over in a town where nobody knew her name or the horrors she had survived. El Paso, Texas, 1877. A border town alive with promise and peril in equal measure. The railway had brought commerce, the silver mines brought fortune seekers, and Pearl brought nothing but her secrets and scars, both visible and hidden. She adjusted the high collar of her travel-worn dress, ensuring it covered the jagged scar that trailed from behind her ear down her neck. 3 years had passed since that night, but the memories remained as fresh as an open wound. "Madam, you need help with your trunk," the stagecoach driver called, already hauling her small wooden chest from the roof rack. "I can manage," Pearl replied softly, her voice barely audible above the falling rain. Independence had become her shield, trust had become her enemy. The driver nodded and set her trunk on the boardwalk. "Suit yourself." "Hotel's just yonder," he said, pointing toward a 2-story building with glowing windows that promised warmth and shelter. Pearl paid him the remaining fare and stood alone as the stagecoach rolled away, spattering her skirts with mud. She was 23 years old and completely alone in a town where the only person expecting her was Mrs. Henderson, a widowed shopkeeper who had advertised for help in the Austin newspaper. As she struggled with her trunk, a tall figure emerged from the saloon across the street. Even through the downpour, she could see the unmistakable silhouette of a cowboy wide-brimmed hat, long duster coat, and the confident stride of a man who knew his place in the world. Pearl quickly looked away. Men like that were dangerous. Men like that made promises they never kept. Men like that took what wasn't freely given. "Looks like you could use a hand there, madam," came a deep voice as the man approached, boots splashing through puddles. Pearl stiffened. "No thank you, sir, I'm quite capable." The man stopped a respectful distance away. Rain dripped from his hat brim as he studied her with eyes the color of a summer storm. "Never doubted that for a moment, but that trunk looks mighty heavy and the hotel's a piece away yet." Pearl hesitated, weighing her options. Her arms already ached from the journey and the rain was coming down harder now. "Name's Garrett O'Malley," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy. Water cascaded from the brim. "Just offering neighborly assistance, nothing more." Something in his steady gaze made Pearl relent. "Very well, Mr. O'Malley. Just Garrett, madam." He replaced his hat and lifted her trunk with ease, waiting for her to lead the way. They walked in silence through the rain, Pearl acutely aware of his presence behind her. She'd learned to sense danger, to feel eyes that lingered too long, to hear the hidden meanings in seemingly innocent words. But this man, this cowboy, kept a respectful distance and said nothing more. The hotel lobby was a welcome relief from the weather. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat in the corner, and oil lamps cast a warm glow over worn but clean furnishings. "Evening, Mr. Reynolds," Garrett called to the man behind the desk. "Lady here needs a room." The hotel clerk looked up from his ledger. "Of course." "Just passing through, madam, or staying a spell?" "I'll be working for Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile," Pearl replied, reaching for her purse. "I'm not certain how long I'll need accommodations." "Ah, Clara's new shop girl. She mentioned you'd be arriving." The clerk nodded. "We can arrange weekly rates if you'll be staying on." Garrett set her trunk down gently. "Clara Henderson's a good woman, lost her husband in the war but built that business up from nothing." He seemed about to say more, then touched the brim of his hat instead. "Well, I'll leave you to get settled, Miss Lawson," Pearl supplied after a moment's hesitation. "Pearl Lawson. Miss Lawson," he nodded. "Welcome to El Paso." As he turned to leave, she found herself saying, "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. O'Malley." He glanced back, a gentle smile crossing his weather-worn face. "Like I said, just being neighborly." When the door closed behind him, Pearl released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Something about Garrett O'Malley unsettled her, not in the way that made her fear for her safety, but in a way that threatened the walls she'd so carefully constructed around her heart. Room 8, top of the stairs, Mr. Reynolds said, handing her a key. Breakfast is served from 6 to 8. Do you need help with your trunk? No, thank you, Pearl replied automatically. Her independence was all she had left. Alone in her simple room, Pearl unpacked her meager belongings. A few dresses, undergarments, a hairbrush that had belonged to her mother, and a small Derringer pistol that had saved her life once before. She placed the gun under her pillow, a habit she couldn't break even in this new town. The rain continued to fall as night settled over El Paso. Pearl stood by the window, watching as lamps were lit in buildings and occasional figures hurried through the wet streets. She caught sight of a tall man in a duster crossing toward the livery stable. Even from a distance, she recognized Garrett O'Malley's distinctive gait. A new town, she whispered to herself. A new beginning. But as she prepared for bed, Pearl knew that new beginnings were rarely as clean as they seemed. The past had a way of following, like shadows in the rain. Morning brought clear skies and the promise of a scorching Texas day. Pearl dressed carefully in her plainest work dress, a dark blue cotton garment with long sleeves despite the heat. She braided her chestnut hair tightly and pinned it in a no-nonsense coil at the nape of her neck. The less attention she drew, the safer she would be. After a quick breakfast in the hotel dining room, Pearl made her way to Henderson's Mercantile. The shop occupied a prime corner location on El Paso's Main Street, its freshly painted sign and clean windows standing out among the more weathered establishments. A bell jingled cheerfully as Pearl entered. The store was well stocked and meticulously organized, with everything from dry goods to hardware to yard goods arranged in tidy displays. "You must be Pearl," came a warm voice from behind the counter. "Right on time. I appreciate punctuality." Clara Henderson was a handsome woman in her early 40s, with silver streaks in her dark hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She wore a practical brown dress with an immaculate white apron, a pencil tucked behind one ear. "Yes, madam," Pearl nodded. "Thank you for the opportunity." "Your references were impeccable." Mrs. Henderson came around the counter. "The Austin shop spoke very highly of your accounting skills and customer service." Pearl had indeed worked in an Austin dry goods store for nearly 6 months. It had been a good position, but when the owner's son had begun to take too much interest in her, she'd known it was time to move on. "I'm a quick learner," Pearl said, "and I'm not afraid of hard work." "Good, that's exactly what I need." Mrs. Henderson gestured around the store. "I've built this business from nothing after my Thomas passed. It's more than a store to me, it's my legacy. I need someone I can count on." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of instruction. Pearl learned the inventory system, pricing structure, and the peculiarities of local customers. By midday, she was confidently waiting on customers while Mrs. Henderson worked on accounts in the back office. The bell over the door jingled, and Pearl looked up to see Garrett O'Malley enter, removing his hat as he stepped inside. He looked different in daylight, younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with a face tanned by the sun and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Morning, Miss Lawson," he said, genuine surprise and pleasure in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Mr. O'Malley." Pearl nodded formally. "How may I help you today?" "Just picking up my monthly supplies." He approached the counter. "I've got a list here somewhere." He patted his pockets until he found a folded paper. Pearl took it, noting the neat handwriting. "I'll gather these for you." As she moved around the store collecting the items: coffee, sugar, flour, ammunition for a Winchester rifle, tobacco, she felt his eyes following her. Not in the predatory way she'd grown to fear, but with an openness that was somehow more disconcerting. "You settling in all right?" he asked as she measured coffee beans. "Yes, thank you." Pearl kept her responses brief, discouraged conversation. "El Paso's a good town for the most part," he continued, undeterred. "Growing fast since the railroad came through, but still got a sense of community." Pearl nodded without looking up. She finished gathering his supplies and began tallying the total. "That'll be $3.72, she said, finally meeting his gaze. Garrett counted out the money. Their fingers brushed as she took the coins, and Pearl withdrew her hand quickly. "You know," he said casually, "there's a social at the church this Sunday after services. Good way to meet folks. I'm not much for socializing, Pearl replied, wrapping his purchases in brown paper. Garrett studied her for a moment. Everyone needs friends, Miss Lawson, even independent sorts. Before Pearl could respond, the door opened again and 3 men entered. Something in their swagger, in the way they surveyed the store like they were assessing its value, set Pearl's nerves on edge. Garrett's demeanor changed instantly. He straightened, his relaxed posture becoming alert. He moved slightly, positioning himself between Pearl and the newcomers. "Vince," he acknowledged the leader, a man with a thin mustache and cold eyes. "Thought you boys were headed to Silver City." "Changed our minds," Vince replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "El Paso's been good to us lately." His gaze slid to Pearl, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Especially now that the scenery's improving." Pearl dropped her eyes, busying herself with rearranging items on the counter. She'd encountered men like this before, men who viewed women as conquests, as possessions. "Miss Lawson is new in town," Garrett said, his voice carrying a warning. "Works for Mrs. Henderson now." "Is that so?" Vince leaned against the counter. "Well, welcome to El Paso, Miss Lawson." "I'm Vince Harmon. These are my associates, Nate and Cody." Pearl forced herself to look up. "Thank you. How may I help you gentlemen today?" Vince smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Oh, I'm sure you could help me in all sorts of ways." Garrett's jaw tightened. "They were just leaving," he said firmly. "Weren't you, Vince?" Tension crackled between the men. Pearl's hand drifted to her skirt pocket where she kept a small knife. The standoff was broken when Mrs. Henderson emerged from the back office. "Ah, Mr. Harmon," she said coolly. "I've just finished tallying your outstanding account. That'll be $14.36 unless you'd like to add to it today." Vince's expression soured. "Put it on my tab, Mrs. Henderson. I'm good for it." "I'm sure you are," she replied, unconvinced. "But I'm afraid I must insist on payment before any further credit is extended." Vince stared at her for a long moment before reaching into his vest and extracting a few bills. He slapped them on the counter. "There, that should cover it." Mrs. Henderson counted the money calmly. "This is only $10, Mr. Harmon." "It's all I've got right now," he said through gritted teeth. "You'll get the rest." "Very well." She made a notation in her ledger. "Will there be anything else today?" Vince glanced at Pearl once more, then at Garrett, whose hand had casually moved to rest near his holstered revolver. "Not today," he finally said. "Come on, boys." The 3 men left, the bell jingling harshly in their wake. "Trouble, Mrs. Henderson muttered, watching them through the window as they crossed to the saloon. She turned to Pearl. "Vince Harmon fancies himself a businessman, but he's little more than a thug with ambitions. Best to keep your distance." "Yes, madam," Pearl agreed, the knot in her stomach slowly loosening. "And you, Garrett," Mrs. Henderson continued, "don't go looking for trouble on my account. I can handle Vince Harmon." "Wasn't planning to," Garrett replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. He gathered his packages. "But a man like that only understands one language." "And it's not one I want spoken in my store," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Now, is there anything else you need today?" Garrett glanced at Pearl. "Not today, Clara. Thanks for the supplies." As he headed for the door, he paused beside Pearl. "Sunday," he said quietly. "Church social." "Think about it." Then he was gone, the bell announcing his departure with a gentler tone than it had for Vince and his men. "That man," Mrs. Henderson said, watching Garrett through the window, "is one of the good ones. Owns a small ranch about 5 miles east of town. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's always the first to help when there's trouble." Pearl said nothing, but she couldn't help watching as Garrett mounted a handsome bay horse and rode away, his straight back and broad shoulders a stark contrast to Vince Harmon's slouching menace. "Well, Mrs. Henderson said briskly, let's get back to work. Those inventory sheets won't complete themselves." The rest of the day passed without incident. Pearl proved herself adept at both customer service and bookkeeping, earning a rare smile of approval from Mrs. Henderson. "You'll do," the older woman said as they closed the shop at sunset. "I think we'll work well together, Pearl." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." Pearl felt a small spark of pride. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to feel accomplished at anything. "Clara," the woman corrected. When it's just us, I'm Clara. Pearl nodded, touched by the gesture of friendship. Thank you, Clara. As they parted ways outside the store, Clara to her rooms above the shop, Pearl to the hotel, the older woman added, and Pearl, Garrett was right about the church social. It would be good for you to meet people. This town can be lonely for a single woman. Pearl managed a non-committal smile. I'll consider it. But as she walked back to the hotel, Pearl knew she wouldn't attend. Social gatherings meant questions about her past, about the scar she hid beneath high collars, about the husband she'd fled from 3 years ago. It meant explaining how a respectable rancher's wife from Colorado had become a solitary woman moving from town to town, always looking over her shoulder. No, Pearl thought as she climbed the stairs to her lonely room, some wounds were better left undisturbed, some stories better left untold. The week passed in a comfortable routine. Pearl proved herself invaluable at the mercantile, organizing inventory and suggesting improvements to the bookkeeping system. Clara was impressed, giving Pearl more responsibility with each passing day. Garrett O'Malley came in twice more that week, each time with legitimate business, but lingering longer than necessary. He seemed to sense Pearl's reluctance to engage and kept his conversation general, asking about the store or commenting on the weather, never pressing for personal details. By Saturday, Pearl had begun to feel more secure in El Paso. Vince Harmon and his associates had not returned to the store, and the other townspeople had been welcoming if not overly friendly. She was still the newcomer, still an object of curiosity, but she was finding her place. That evening, after closing the shop, Clara invited Pearl to share a simple supper in her rooms above the store. The apartment was cozy and feminine, filled with mementos of Clara's life, a portrait of a handsome man in a Union uniform, delicate china teacups, well-worn books lining shelves. My Thomas, Clara explained, noticing Pearl's gaze on the portrait, killed at Antietam. We had only been married 3 years. I'm sorry, Pearl said sincerely. Clara shrugged, a practiced gesture that didn't quite hide her lingering grief. It was a long time ago, 15 years this September. They ate at a small table by the window, watching as El Paso's Saturday night activities began to unfold. Cowboys fresh from surrounding ranches seeking entertainment, merchants closing their shops, families heading home for dinner. Have you given any more thought to the social tomorrow? Clara asked as she poured coffee. Pearl hesitated. I'm not sure it would be appropriate. I've only just arrived. Nonsense, Clara interrupted. That's precisely why you should attend. It's how we welcome newcomers. She studied Pearl over the rim of her cup. Unless there's another reason you're reluctant, Pearl looked down, uncomfortable under Clara's perceptive gaze. I'm just not accustomed to socializing much. Clara set her cup down. Pearl, I didn't ask for your life story when I hired you. Your references were excellent, and that's what mattered to me, but I recognize a woman who's running from something. She held up a hand when Pearl began to protest. No, don't deny it. I've been there myself. After Thomas died, I couldn't bear the pitying looks, the well-meaning but painful questions, so I left Pittsburgh and came west. Pearl remained silent, her coffee growing cold before her. Whatever you're running from, Clara continued gently, it doesn't define you, not unless you let it. Pearl looked up, meeting Clara's kind eyes. You don't understand. Perhaps not the specifics, Clara acknowledged, but I understand hiding. And I understand that sometimes to truly heal we need to stop running. The words struck Pearl deeply. She had been running for 3 years, moving whenever she felt too visible, too vulnerable. El Paso was just the latest stop in a journey with no destination. I was married, Pearl found herself saying, the words emerging unbidden. In Colorado, he was not the man I thought I had married. Clara waited, not pushing for more. I left, Pearl continued, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, sometimes I think he's still looking for me. Is he? Clara asked directly. Pearl touched her neck where the scar lay hidden beneath her collar. The last time he found me, he promised it would be the last time I ran. Understanding dawned in Clara's eyes. I see, she said quietly. They sat in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the town filtering through the open window, piano music from the saloon, laughter, the occasional shout. Well, Clara finally said. All the more reason to attend tomorrow, make connections, friends, people who would stand by you if needed. Pearl shook her head. I can't risk involving others in my problems. Not even Garrett O'Malley, Clara asked with raised eyebrows. He seems quite taken with you, especially not him, Pearl replied firmly. I've seen what happens when good men try to fight other men's battles, Clara sighed. You're a grown woman, Pearl, I won't press you further. But the invitation stands both to the social and to share what burdens you when you're ready. She began clearing the table. Now, help me with these dishes, and then you should get back to the hotel before full dark. Later, as Pearl walked back to the hotel, the conversation with Clara echoed in her mind. She had revealed more than she'd intended, yet somehow felt lighter for having done so. Perhaps Clara was right, perhaps it was time to stop running, to build something resembling a real life. The town was alive with Saturday night revelry. The saloon across from the hotel was particularly boisterous, light and music spilling onto the street. As Pearl approached, the batwing doors swung open and Vince Harmon emerged, followed by his two companions. Pearl froze, then quickly moved toward the shadows beside a closed barbershop, but it was too late. Vince had spotted her. Well, look here, boys, he called, his voice slurred with drink. It's the pretty new shop girl out for an evening stroll. Pearl's heart hammered in her chest as the three men approached. She glanced around, but the street was momentarily empty in this section. Good evening, Mr. Harmon, she said with forced calm. If you'll excuse me, I'm heading back to my hotel. Vince stepped directly in her path. Why such a hurry? Night's just getting started. Why don't you join us for a drink? No, thank you. Pearl tried to step around him, but Vince moved with her. Come on now, he persisted, reaching for her arm. Don't be unfriendly. Pearl pulled back sharply. Please step aside, Mr. Harmon. Vince's expression hardened. You think you're too good for me? Is that it? I think the lady asked you to step aside, Vince. The voice came from behind Pearl, steady and hard as steel. Relief flooded through her as she recognized it. Garrett O'Malley stood a few paces away, his stance relaxed but his eyes alert and dangerous. He wasn't wearing his gun belt, but something in his demeanor suggested he didn't need it. This ain't your business, O'Malley, Vince snarled, but he took a half step back from Pearl. Miss Lawson works for a friend of mine, Garrett replied evenly. That makes her welfare my business. Nate, the taller of Vince's companions, stepped forward. There's three of us and one of you, Cowboy. Garrett smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Math never was my strong suit. Want to test if that matters? The tension stretched taut between them. Pearl held her breath, acutely aware of how quickly situations like this could turn deadly. Finally, Vince spat on the ground. Come on, boys. Plenty of women in this town who know how to be friendly. As the three men swaggered away, Pearl released a shaky breath. You all right? Garrett asked, moving closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. Yes, Pearl managed. Thank you. Let me walk you to the hotel, he said, offering his arm. Pearl hesitated only briefly before accepting. His forearm was solid beneath her fingers, reassuring in its strength. Were you following me? She asked as they crossed the street. Garrett chuckled. No, madam, just happened to be leaving the gunsmith's when I saw you. Lucky timing. They reached the hotel steps too soon. Pearl withdrew her hand from his arm, immediately missing its warmth. Thank you again, Mr. O'Malley. Garrett, he corrected. And you're welcome, Miss Lawson. Pearl nodded, suddenly shy. Pearl, she offered. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Pearl, he repeated, as if tasting the word. Are you attending the social tomorrow? The question hung between them. Pearl thought of Clara's words, of the warmth of connection, of this man who had now twice come to her aid without presumption. I'm considering it, she said finally. I hope you do, Garrett replied. El Paso could use more people like you. Before she could ask what he meant, he tipped his hat and turned away. Pearl watched him walk down the street, his long stride carrying him quickly into the gathering darkness. Inside her room, Pearl stood at the window for a long time, watching the life of the town unfold below. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine belonging somewhere, having a place that felt like home. But as she finally prepared for bed, her hand automatically checking the derringer beneath her pillow, the old fear resurfaced. Derek Lawson had promised to find her, to reclaim what was his. If he ever did, if he discovered she had begun to build a life, to form attachments, those connections would become weapons he could use against her. "I'm damaged goods," Pearl whispered to her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The woman who looked back had shadows in her eyes and a scar hidden beneath her collar. A woman no man would want once he knew her story, especially not a man like Garrett O'Malley. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed created specifically for church socials and new beginnings. Pearl woke early, her decision made. She would attend services. She genuinely missed the comfort of worship, but she would skip the social afterward. She would be polite but distant. She would resist the pull she felt toward Garrett O'Malley and the friendship offered by Clara Henderson. It was safer that way. For everyone, she dressed in her best dress, a modest navy blue with white trim at the collar and cuffs. The high neckline concealed her scar completely. She arranged her hair in a simple but flattering style and topped it with a small hat adorned with a single silk flower. The church bells were ringing as Pearl made her way through town. El Paso looked different on Sunday morning, quieter, more respectable. Families walked together toward the white clapboard church at the end of Main Street, men in their Sunday best, women in colorful dresses, children scrubbed clean and on their best behavior. Pearl slipped into a pew near the back, nodding politely to those who glanced her way but not encouraging conversation. The church filled quickly, the townspeople greeting each other with the easy familiarity of community. She was studying the simple stained glass window behind the pulpit when a presence beside her made her turn. Garrett O'Malley, looking uncommonly formal in a dark suit, slid into the pew next to her. "Morning, Pearl," he said quietly, using her given name with a familiarity that should have bothered her but somehow didn't. "Mind if I join you?" Pearl hesitated, then nodded, moving slightly to make room. His clean, masculine scent soap leather, and something uniquely him enveloped her as he settled beside her. It was oddly comforting. The service was simple but heartfelt. The minister, a young man with earnest eyes and a powerful speaking voice, delivered a sermon on redemption and second chances that seemed directed specifically at Pearl. She found herself unexpectedly moved, tears pricking at her eyes as he spoke of God's capacity to make all things new. Beside her, Garrett sat attentive and respectful, occasionally joining in the hymns with a surprisingly pleasant baritone. He didn't try to engage her in conversation during the service, seeming content simply to be present beside her. When the final prayer was said, and the congregation began to move toward the doors and the social gathering that would take place on the church grounds, Pearl remained seated, gathering her resolve to slip away unnoticed. Garrett seemed to sense her intention. "The social's right out back," he said, rising and offering his hand. "Clara makes the best apple cake this side of the Mississippi." Pearl looked up at him, at his extended hand and hopeful expression, and felt her resolve wavering. "I don't think I can." "Just for a little while," he urged gently. "No obligations. If you want to leave, I'll walk you back to the hotel myself." Something in his understanding, his lack of pressure, made Pearl reconsider. Perhaps Clara had been right. Perhaps it was time to stop running, to at least try to be part of something again. "Very well," she said, placing her hand in his, "but just for a short time." Garrett's smile was worth the risk. He guided her through the crowd, nodding to acquaintances but not stopping to introduce her, allowing Pearl to adjust gradually to the social setting. The churchyard had been transformed with tables laden with food, benches arranged in conversational groupings, and children playing under a large oak tree. It was idyllic, like something from a life Pearl had once dreamed of but had stopped believing possible. "Garrett, you made it." A young woman approached, her blonde hair shining in the sunlight. She was heavily pregnant, her condition obvious despite the fashionable cut of her dress. A tall man with kind eyes stood protectively at her side. "And you've brought company, Sarah, Matthew," Garrett greeted them warmly. "This is Miss Pearl Lawson. She's recently arrived in El Paso and is working with Clara at the Mercantile. He turned to Pearl. Pearl, this is Sarah Baxter and her husband Matthew. They run the newspaper. Pleased to meet you, Miss Lawson, Matthew said, extending his hand. Any friend of Garrett's is welcome here. Thank you, Pearl replied, surprised by their immediate acceptance. And please call me Pearl, Sarah beamed. Pearl it is, and you must call me Sarah. I'm so glad you've come. We don't get many new faces in El Paso, especially not single ladies. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. You've already caused quite a stir among the eligible bachelors. Pearl felt heat rise in her cheeks. I assure you I'm not here seeking. Sarah, Garrett interrupted with gentle reproach, don't embarrass Pearl. She's only just getting to know our little community. Sarah laughed, resting a hand on her swollen belly. Forgive me, pregnancy has destroyed what little filter I possessed. She linked her arm through Pearl's. Come, let me introduce you to some of the other ladies while Garrett helps Matthew with the lemonade. Before Pearl could protest, she was being led toward a group of women arranging food on a long table. Garrett gave her an encouraging nod before heading off with Matthew. The afternoon unfolded more pleasantly than Pearl could have imagined. Sarah introduced her to several women who welcomed her warmly, asking about her skills at the Mercantile rather than prying into her past. Clara appeared, serving her famous apple cake and beaming with approval when she saw Pearl socializing. Throughout, Garrett maintained a respectful but constant presence, never too close but always visible, as if wanting to ensure she felt secure. When he did approach, it was to offer lemonade or to introduce her to more townspeople, never pressuring or claiming her attention exclusively. As the afternoon waned, Pearl found herself relaxing, even enjoying the simple pleasure of community. These people had no knowledge of her past, no preconceptions. To them, she was simply Pearl Lawson, Clara's capable new assistant, a newcomer worthy of welcome. She was speaking with the minister's wife, a lively woman named Rebecca, when a commotion at the edge of the gathering caught her attention. A group of men had arrived, Vince Harmon among them. They weren't openly disruptive, but their presence sent a ripple of tension through the social. Oh dear, Rebecca sighed. Mr. Harmon rarely attends church, but never misses an opportunity to make his presence felt at community gatherings. Pearl watched as Vince surveyed the crowd, his gaze predatory. When his eyes landed on her, a slow smile spread across his face and he began moving in her direction. Excuse me, Pearl murmured to Rebecca, turning away quickly. She needed to leave to avoid a confrontation that could only end badly. She nearly collided with Garrett, who had appeared at her side as if summoned by her distress. Vince is here, she said unnecessarily. Garrett nodded, his expression hardening as he glanced over her shoulder. I see him. Do you want to leave? The simple question, offered without judgment, touched Pearl deeply. He wasn't trying to protect her or make decisions for her, he was respecting her choice. Yes, she admitted. I think that would be best. All right then, let me just tell Matthew we're going. Pearl watched as Garrett spoke briefly to Matthew, who nodded with understanding. When Garrett returned to her side, he offered his arm. This way, he said, guiding her toward a side path that would lead them away from the church without passing near Vince. We can cut through the alley to Main Street. They walked in companionable silence, the sounds of the social fading behind them. Pearl was acutely aware of Garrett's solid presence beside her, of the gentle way he matched his longer stride to her smaller steps. Thank you, she said as they emerged onto Main Street. For understanding, Garrett glanced down at her, his eyes serious. Vince Harmon has a way of making people uncomfortable. You're not the first to leave when he arrives. It's not just that, Pearl admitted. Men like him. I've encountered them before. Garrett was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his words. Pearl, I don't know what happened to you before you came to El Paso, and I won't ask, but I want you to know that you're safe here. This town has its rough edges, but there are more good people than bad. Pearl looked away, unable to meet his earnest gaze. Sometimes the bad ones are all it takes. That's true enough, he acknowledged, but sometimes the good ones can make a difference too. They had reached the hotel. Pearl withdrew her hand from his arm, already missing the connection. Will I see you at the store tomorrow? Garrett asked. Pearl nodded. Yes, I'll be there. Good. He smiled, that sunrise smile that warmed her from within. Thank you for attending the social today. I know it wasn't easy for you. It was. Nicer than I expected, Pearl admitted. I'm glad. Garrett touched the brim of his hat. Good afternoon, Pearl. Pearl watched him walk away, conflicting emotions swirling within her. The afternoon had shown her a glimpse of what life could be: community, friendship, perhaps even something more. But it had also reminded her of the dangers that lurked, of men like Vince who saw women as conquests to be claimed. And somewhere out there was Derek, a man who believed she belonged to him, who had vowed to find her no matter how far she ran. As May turned to June, El Paso sweltered under an unrelenting sun. The dry heat was different from the humid summers Pearl had known in other places, but no less oppressive. Still, she found herself settling into a routine, even beginning to feel at home in the border town. The mercantile thrived under Clara's shrewd business sense and Pearl's organizational skills. They made a good team, with Clara handling supplier relationships and Pearl managing inventory and accounts. On busy days, they both waited on customers, Pearl gradually becoming more comfortable with the townspeople who frequented the store. Garrett came in regularly, sometimes for legitimate supplies, sometimes on transparent pretexts that fooled neither Pearl nor Clara. He never pressed Pearl for more than she was willing to give, seeming content with their growing friendship. Pearl found herself looking forward to his visits, to his quiet humor and steady presence. He told her stories of his small ranch, of the horses he raised and trained, of his dreams to expand someday. She shared little of her own past in return, but he never seemed to mind the imbalance. One evening in late June, as Pearl was closing the store, Garrett appeared with an unexpected proposal. "I'm driving out to the Baxters' place tomorrow," he said, leaning against the counter as Pearl tallied the day's receipts. "Sarah's time is near, and Matthew's commissioned a cradle from a carpenter outside of town. I've offered to collect it." Pearl looked up, surprised by the sudden change in topic from their previous discussion of saddle leather. "That's kind of you." "I was wondering if you'd like to come along," Garrett continued, a hint of nervousness beneath his casual tone. "It's a pleasant drive, and Sarah would be glad of female company. She's confined to bed rest these days." Pearl hesitated. Leaving town, even for an afternoon, seemed fraught with risk. And yet, the idea of escaping the heat and crowds of El Paso for a few hours was tempting. "It's perfectly proper," Garrett added quickly. "The Baxters' ranch is only an hour's drive. We'd be back well before dark." "I'd need to ask Clara if she can spare me," Pearl said, surprising herself with the implicit acceptance. "Already did," Garrett admitted with a sheepish smile. "She suggested I invite you, says you work too hard and need some fresh air." Pearl laughed despite herself. "Did she now?" "So you'll come?" His hopeful expression was impossible to resist. "Yes," Pearl found herself saying. "I'd like that." Garrett's smile was radiant. "I'll come by at 9 tomorrow morning. Wear something cool, it'll be hot out on the open road." After he left, Pearl finished closing the store in a state of pleasant anticipation. It had been years since she'd allowed herself such a simple pleasure as a drive in the country with a friend. The prospect filled her with both excitement and trepidation. The next morning dawned hot and clear, the sky an endless blue expanse promising another scorching day. Pearl dressed carefully in her lightest dress, a pale blue cotton with short sleeves that she normally considered too revealing. But given the heat, practicality won over modesty. She added a wide-brimmed hat and lightweight gloves. Garrett arrived punctually at 9, driving a well-maintained buckboard wagon pulled by 2 handsome bay horses. He helped Pearl up onto the seat with gentle hands that lingered no longer than propriety allowed. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked as he took his place beside her. "I suppose that depends on your definition of adventure," Pearl replied with a smile. "Just a pleasant drive with good company," Garrett assured her, flicking the reins to set the horses in motion. They left El Paso behind, the road stretching before them across the rugged landscape. The countryside was beautiful in its stark, unforgiving way scrubby vegetation, distant mountains, and a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. Conversation flowed easily between them as they traveled. Garrett pointed out landmarks, told stories of the area, asked Pearl's opinion on matters ranging from horse breeding to politics. He never pushed for personal revelations, seeming content with whatever she was willing to share. "How did you come to El Paso?" Pearl asked as they passed a stand of cottonwoods marking a hidden spring. "After the war," Garrett replied, his expression momentarily distant. "I fought for the Union, came back to find my family's farm in Missouri taken over by men who'd stayed home, decided to head west and start fresh." "I'm sorry about your farm," Pearl said softly. Garrett shrugged. "It worked out for the best. I'm not much of a farmer anyway. Horses are more my calling." He glanced at her. "What about you? What brought you to our dusty little corner of Texas?" The direct question caught Pearl off guard. She looked away, watching a hawk circle overhead. "I needed a change," she said finally. The position with Clara seemed like a good opportunity. Garrett nodded, accepting the vague answer without comment. After a moment, he pointed toward a distant smudge on the horizon. "That's the Baxter place up ahead." The Baxter Ranch was modest but well-tended, with a neat clapboard house, several outbuildings, and corrals containing horses and cattle. Matthew met them in the yard, his face showing the strain of worry for his wife. "Garrett, Miss Lawson." "Thank you for coming," he greeted them, helping Pearl down from the wagon. "Sarah will be so pleased to see you. She's going stir-crazy confined to that bed." Inside, they found Sarah propped up with pillows in a sunny bedroom, her face lighting up at the sight of visitors. "Pearl." "What a wonderful surprise." She extended her hands in welcome. "And you brought my cradle, Garrett. Matthew's been fretting about it for days." "It's in the wagon," Garrett confirmed. "I'll help Matthew bring it in." As the men left to retrieve the cradle, Pearl sat beside Sarah, genuinely glad to see the younger woman despite her initial reservations about the trip. "How are you feeling?" she asked, noting Sarah's flushed cheeks and swollen ankles. "Enormous," Sarah replied with a laugh that turned into a grimace. "And impatient. The doctor says another week at least, but I'm ready for this baby to make an appearance." They chatted easily, Sarah sharing stories of her childhood in Boston and her journey west as a newspaper correspondent, eventually falling in love with Matthew and deciding to stay in El Paso. "And you, Pearl?" Sarah asked, her journalist's curiosity evident. "What's your story?" "Garrett is quite taken with you, you know." Pearl felt heat rise in her cheeks. "There's not much to tell, and Garrett and I are just friends." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "If you say so. But I've known Garrett for 3 years, and I've never seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you." Before Pearl could respond, the men returned carrying a beautiful pine cradle. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with carved details and a smooth, rocking base. "It's perfect," Sarah breathed, tears forming in her eyes. "Just perfect." Matthew beamed with pride as he positioned the cradle beside the bed. "Only the best for our little one." The moment was so tender, so filled with love and anticipation that Pearl felt a pang of something like envy. Not for the baby specifically, but for the simple joy of planning a future with someone who cherished you. They stayed for lunch, a pleasant meal served on the shaded porch where Sarah could join them, carefully helped from her bed by Matthew. The conversation was easy and welcoming, making Pearl feel included in their circle of friendship. As they prepared to leave, Sarah squeezed Pearl's hand. "Come back soon," she urged, "and bring Garrett. You're good for him, you make him smile." The return journey was quieter, both Pearl and Garrett content with occasional comments rather than sustained conversation. The afternoon heat was intense, the sun beating down mercilessly on the open wagon. About halfway back to El Paso, one of the horses stumbled slightly, causing the wagon to lurch. "Whoa there," Garrett called, pulling up on the reins. He frowned, setting the brake and climbing down. "Let me check this." Pearl watched as he examined the horse's left front hoof, speaking soothingly to the animal. "Stone bruise, I think," he called up to her. "Nothing serious, but we should rest him a bit." He led the team off the road toward a cluster of cottonwood trees that promised shade. Pearl remained in the wagon until Garrett returned to help her down. We'll wait here until it cools a bit, he explained. No sense risking the horse, and it's too hot to be out in the sun anyway. The shade beneath the cottonwoods was a blessed relief. Garrett spread a blanket from the back of the wagon and invited Pearl to sit. He offered her water from a canteen, then settled a respectful distance away, leaning against a tree trunk. I apologize for the delay, he said, removing his hat and wiping his brow. Not quite the pleasant drive I promised. It's still pleasant, Pearl assured him. The Baxters are lovely people, and this is a welcome respite from the heat. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the whisper of the leaves above and the occasional call of a distant bird. Pearl removed her hat, enjoying the slight breeze that stirred her hair. May I ask you something, Pearl? Garrett said suddenly. Pearl tensed slightly, her guard rising. You may ask, she replied cautiously. Garrett seemed to choose his words carefully. What happened to make you so afraid? The direct question caught Pearl by surprise. She looked away, focusing on a distant mountain peak. What makes you think I'm afraid? I recognize the signs, Garrett said quietly. The way you're always aware of exits, of who's around you, the way you flinch when someone moves too quickly. The scar you hide beneath your collars. Pearl's hand flew to her neck where her collar had slipped in the heat, potentially exposing the edge of her scar. You noticed? I notice everything about you, Garrett admitted, not to pry but because I care. The simple declaration hung between them, honest and unadorned. Pearl felt tears prick at her eyes. It was my husband, she said finally, the words emerging in a rush. In Colorado, he wasn't kind. Garrett remained perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might stop her words. When I finally left him, Pearl continued, her voice barely above a whisper, he came after me, found me in Denver, said I belonged to him, that no one else would ever want damaged goods like me. Her hand moved unconsciously to her neck. This was his parting gift. A reminder that he would find me again. And you've been running ever since, Garrett concluded softly. Pearl nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Garrett's voice was gentle but firm when he finally spoke. Pearl, look at me. Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his. I don't see damaged goods when I look at you, he said with quiet intensity. I see a survivor, a woman of extraordinary strength and courage, a woman I've come to admire more than any other I've known. The words washed over Pearl like a cleansing rain, unexpected and overwhelming. Tears spilled down her cheeks as emotions she'd suppressed for years broke free. Garrett moved closer slowly, telegraphing his intentions as he reached for her hand. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers with exquisite gentleness. You don't have to run anymore, he said. Not from him. Not from the possibility of happiness, not from this. He lifted their joined hands. Whatever this might become, Pearl stared at their intertwined fingers, so different yet somehow perfectly matched. I'm afraid, she admitted, not just of him finding me. I'm afraid to trust, to hope, to believe that something good could last. I understand fear, Garrett said. I came back from the war a different man than the boy who left, saw things, did things that haunt me still. His thumb traced small circles on her palm. But I've learned that fear only wins if we let it dictate our choices. Pearl looked into his eyes, seeing not pity but understanding, not desire but respect. What if he finds me again? Then he'll find you're not alone anymore, Garrett replied simply. The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibility. Then, with a gentleness that brought fresh tears to her eyes, Garrett raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. No expectations, he promised. No pressure, just know that you have a friend in me, Pearl Lawson. Someone who sees your worth, your strength, and your beauty, scars and all. The ride back to El Paso was quieter, but the silence was comfortable, filled with new understanding. Garrett kept his word, not pressing for more than Pearl was ready to give. But something had shifted between them, a door opening to possibilities Pearl had thought forever closed to her. As summer blazed across El Paso, Pearl found herself gradually lowering the walls she'd built around her heart. She still maintained her vigilance, still checked for familiar faces in crowds, still kept the Derringer under her pillow. But she also began to accept invitations to Sunday dinners at Clara's, to visit Sarah and her newborn son, to accompany Garrett on occasional rides outside town. Garrett was patient, never pushing for more than friendship, though his feelings were clear in his eyes. In the gentle way he watched over her without smothering her independence. One evening in late July, Pearl was working late at the Mercantile, preparing for a shipment due to arrive the next day. Clara had gone upstairs with a headache, leaving Pearl to finish the inventory lists alone. The bell over the door jingled, and Pearl looked up with a smile, expecting Garrett, who often walked her back to the hotel when she worked late. Instead, Vince Harmon stood in the doorway, his thin face flushed with drink, his eyes narrowed with malicious intent. "Store's closed, Mr. Harmon," Pearl said firmly, her hand moving instinctively to the small knife she kept in her pocket. "You'll need to come back tomorrow." "Not here for shopping," Vince replied, moving further into the store. "Here to talk to you, Miss Lawson, or should I say Mrs. Lawson?" Pearl froze, ice flooding her veins. "I don't know what you're talking about," Vince smiled unpleasantly, pulling a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Got an interesting letter from a business associate in Denver. Says there's a man looking for his runaway wife, offering a reward for information." He unfolded the paper to reveal a crude drawing that, despite its lack of artistry, was recognizably Pearl. "Seems you match the description." Pearl's mind raced. She needed to get to her room, to the derringer, to her emergency funds. She needed to run, to disappear again. How much? She asked, buying time as she edged toward the back door. Vince shrugged. "Enough to make it worth my while, but I got to thinking, maybe there's more than one way to profit from this situation." "What do you want?" Pearl demanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "That depends on you," Vince replied, moving closer. "Could send a telegram tonight, let your husband know exactly where to find his property, or," he leered at her, "you could convince me to stay quiet." The implication was clear. Pearl's grip tightened on the knife in her pocket. "Mr. Harmon, I suggest you leave now. Clara is upstairs and Garrett will be here any minute." "Old woman's got a headache," Vince sneered, "and O'Malley's out at his ranch. Saw him ride out this afternoon myself." He took another step forward. "No one's coming to save you, Pearl. It's just you and me." Pearl pulled the knife from her pocket, holding it before her. "Stay back," Vince laughed. "Feisty, I like that. Your husband mentioned you might be spirited." He lunged suddenly, grabbing her wrist and twisting until the knife clattered to the floor. Pearl fought, all the terror and rage of her past surging through her. She was not the same frightened woman who had fled Colorado. She was stronger now, more determined. She would not be a victim again. She brought her knee up sharply, catching Vince in the groin. He doubled over with a howl of pain, releasing her wrist. Pearl darted around him, heading for the door, but he recovered quickly, grabbing her skirt and yanking her back. "You'll pay for that," he snarled, raising his hand to strike her. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the store. Vince froze, his eyes widening in shock and pain. He looked down at his shoulder, where blood was beginning to spread across his shirt. Clara stood on the stairs leading to her apartment, a shotgun in her hands, her face a mask of cold fury. "The next one goes somewhere more vital, Harmon," she said calmly. "Step away from her." Vince stumbled back, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "She's a wanted woman," he gasped. "Runaway wife. There's a reward." "I don't care if she's Jesse James," Clara replied, descending the stairs with the shotgun still trained on Vince. "You don't touch a woman in my store. Now get out before I decide El Paso would be better off without your kind." Vince glared at them both, hatred and pain contorting his features. "This isn't over," he threatened as he backed toward the door. "Either I collect that reward or someone else will. He'll find you, Pearl. They always do." When the door slammed behind him, Pearl's legs gave way. She sank to the floor, trembling violently, the accumulated fear of years breaking over her like a wave. Clara set the shotgun aside and knelt beside her, wrapping a comforting arm around her shoulders. "It's all right," she soothed. "He's gone now." "He knows," Pearl gasped. "Derek, my husband. He's looking for me, offering rewards. I have to leave, Clara. I have to go tonight." "Nonsense," Clara said firmly. "You're not running anymore, Pearl. It's time to stand and fight." Pearl looked up at her friend's determined face. "You don't understand. Derek is dangerous. He nearly killed me the last time. He'll hurt anyone who stands in his way." "Then we'll be ready for him," Clara replied. El Paso takes care of its own, and you're one of us now. Pearl shook her head, unconvinced. I can't risk it. I can't risk you or Garrett. At the mention of Garrett's name, Clara's expression softened. That man cares deeply for you, Pearl. Leaving would hurt him far more than any risk your husband might pose. But no buts, Clara interrupted. We're going to send for the sheriff, report what happened here, and then we're going to send for Garrett. This concerns him too. Pearl wanted to protest further, but exhaustion and the aftermath of fear left her without the strength to argue. She allowed Clara to help her to a chair, to press a cup of strong tea into her hands, to take charge as only Clara could. Sheriff Wilson arrived first, a tall, weathered man with a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened to their account without interruption, then nodded thoughtfully. I'll have a word with Harmon, he said. Assault and attempted extortion should be enough to keep him locked up for a while. He turned to Pearl. As for this husband of yours, is there a legal warrant for your arrest? Pearl shook her head. No, I left him, but that's not a crime. Then he has no legal right to force your return, the sheriff stated flatly. If he shows up causing trouble, he'll answer to me. His confidence was reassuring, but Pearl knew Derek too well to believe that legal barriers would stop him. Derek operated by his own rules, circumventing law and decency with equal disdain. After the sheriff left, promising to return with news of Vince's arrest, Clara sent a boy to Garrett's ranch with an urgent message. Then she insisted Pearl come upstairs to her apartment rather than returning to the hotel. You'll stay with me tonight, she said in a tone that brooked no argument. We'll sort the rest out tomorrow. Exhausted beyond measure, Pearl acquiesced. She sat in Clara's comfortable parlor, wrapped in a borrowed shawl despite the summer heat, feeling chilled from the inside out. It was nearly midnight when the sound of boots on the stairs announced Garrett's arrival. Clara had dozed off in an armchair, but Pearl was wide awake, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Garrett burst through the door, his face etched with worry. He had clearly ridden hard, his clothes dusty, his hat missing. Pearl, he breathed, crossing the room in 3 long strides to kneel before her chair. Are you hurt? Pearl shook her head, overwhelmed by his concern, by the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. I'm fine, Clara. Clara stopped him. Clara stirred at the mention of her name, blinking awake. About time you got here, O'Malley, she grumbled, but her eyes were kind. I'll make some coffee. She disappeared into the small kitchen, leaving Pearl and Garrett alone. Tell me what happened, Garrett said, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. The boy only said there was trouble, that I needed to come quickly. Pearl hesitated, then told him everything: Vince's appearance, his knowledge of Derek, the implied threat. Throughout, Garrett's expression darkened, his jaw tightening with anger, but his hands remained gentle on hers. I have to leave, Pearl concluded. Tonight, before Derek comes, before anyone else gets hurt because of me. No, Garrett said, the single word carrying the weight of absolute conviction. You're not running again, Pearl. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Garrett interrupted. I understand that you're afraid, and with good reason. I understand that this man hurt you, threatened you, made you believe you weren't worthy of safety or happiness. His voice gentled. But I also understand that if you run now, you'll never stop running, you'll never be free. Tears filled Pearl's eyes. I can't bear the thought of him hurting you. Any of you? And I can't bear the thought of you facing this alone, Garrett countered. Not when you don't have to, Clara returned with coffee, setting the tray on a small table. Garrett's right, she said, having overheard the last part of their conversation. Running isn't the answer. Not this time. Pearl looked from one determined face to the other, feeling a strange mixture of fear and hope. What am I supposed to do? Wait for him to find me? No, Garrett said firmly. We prepare, we face this on our terms, not his. How? Pearl asked, desperation coloring her voice. Garrett's expression was resolute. First, you're coming to my ranch. It's isolated, defensible, and no one would think to look for you there. Clara can spread word that you've left town, gone to visit Sarah perhaps. Clara nodded approvingly. I can manage that. And the sheriff already knows to keep an eye out for strangers asking after Pearl. But what about the store? Pearl protested weakly. You need help, especially with the new shipment coming. Clara waved away her concern. "The store will manage without you for a while." "Your safety is more important," Garrett squeezed Pearl's hands. "You trusted me enough to tell me your story, Pearl. Trust me now to help you write a new ending to it." Put that way, how could she refuse? Pearl nodded slowly, surrendering to their care, to the possibility that she didn't have to face her demons alone. The plan came together quickly. Pearl would leave with Garrett before dawn, taking only what she could carry in a small valise. Clara would manage the store and spread the story that Pearl had gone to help Sarah with her new baby. The sheriff would keep an eye on Vince and watch for any strangers asking questions. As the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Pearl found herself on horseback beside Garrett, riding away from El Paso toward his ranch in the hills. The cool morning air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, a cleansing smell that seemed to promise new beginnings. Garrett's ranch was smaller than Pearl had imagined, but beautifully situated on a gentle rise overlooking a shallow valley. The main house was modest but solid, built of local stone with a wide porch wrapping around two sides. A barn, corral, and several smaller outbuildings completed the homestead. "It's not much," Garrett said as they dismounted in the yard, "but it's home." "It's beautiful," Pearl replied honestly, taking in the rugged landscape, the distant mountains, the sense of peace that permeated the place. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, with well-made furniture, colorful woven rugs, and windows that captured both light and views. Garrett showed her to a small bedroom that he explained had belonged to his ranch hand, who had recently left to marry and start his own place. "You'll be comfortable here," he assured her, "and safe. I sleep lightly, and the approach to the ranch is visible for miles." Pearl set her valise on the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the intimacy of being alone with Garrett in his home. He seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'll stable the horses and bring in some water," he said, moving toward the door. "Make yourself at home. There's coffee and food in the kitchen if you're hungry." When he was gone, Pearl explored the room, then the rest of the small house. It was undeniably a bachelor's home, but neat and well kept. Books lined shelves in the main room, many on horse breeding and training, but also volumes of poetry and history that suggested a thoughtful mind. In the kitchen, she found coffee already brewed on the stove. She poured herself a cup and stepped onto the porch, watching as Garrett moved efficiently around the corral, checking on his horses. There were perhaps a dozen animals, all beautifully formed and clearly well cared for. This was his dream, she realized. This ranch, these horses, this life he had built from nothing after losing everything in the war, and he was willing to risk it all to help her. The thought humbled Pearl, filling her with a complex mixture of gratitude and fear. What right did she have to bring her troubles to this peaceful place? To endanger this good man who asked nothing in return for his protection, Garrett looked up, catching her watching him. He raised a hand in greeting, a smile lighting his features. In that moment, standing in the golden morning light, he was so handsome, so vital that Pearl's breath caught in her throat. This was more than gratitude she was feeling, more than friendship. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. The next few days settled into an unexpected harmony. Garrett worked with his horses during the day while Pearl kept house, cooking meals and tidying the already neat rooms. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, talking about everything and nothing as the sun set in spectacular displays over the distant mountains. Garrett never pushed for more than Pearl was ready to give. He slept in the barn the first night, insisting she take the house, until Pearl pointed out the foolishness of such an arrangement if they were truly concerned about her safety. After that, he returned to his room in the house, but Pearl noticed he left his door ajar, ready to respond to any threat. On the fourth day, a rider approached, sending Pearl into momentary panic until Garrett identified him as Matthew Baxter. "News from town," Matthew explained as he dismounted in the yard. "Clara sent me." Over coffee in the kitchen, Matthew updated them. Vince Harmon had been released from jail, his wound not serious enough to keep him confined, but the sheriff was watching him closely. More worryingly, there had been inquiries from a stranger passing through a well-dressed man asking questions about new arrivals, particularly women traveling alone. Clara gave him the story about you visiting us, Matthew assured Pearl. Said he seemed to accept it, but she wasn't convinced. Described him as smooth-talking but with cold eyes. Pearl's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Derek, she whispered. It sounds like Derek. Garrett and Matthew exchanged glances. What does he look like, this husband of yours? Garrett asked. Pearl described Derek Lawson tall, handsome in a conventional way, with dark hair always precisely styled and clothes of the finest quality. He's very charming when he wants to be, she added. Persuasive, people tend to believe whatever he tells them. Matthew nodded. Sounds like the man who came asking, said he was a cousin, concerned about a family matter. He'll figure out the lie, Pearl said, fear creeping back into her voice. He always does. Garrett reached across the table, covering her trembling hand with his. Then we need to be ready when he does. Matthew stayed for lunch, then rode back to El Paso with a message for Clara and the sheriff. After he left, Pearl retreated to the porch, her mind racing with possibilities, each more frightening than the last. Garrett joined her as the afternoon shadows lengthened. You're thinking of running again, he said, not a question but a statement of fact. Pearl didn't deny it. It would be safer for everyone. Everyone except you, Garrett replied. He leaned against the porch railing, facing her directly. Pearl, listen to me. This man, this husband you're so afraid of, he's just a man. Not a demon, not a force of nature. Just a man with no right to control you or harm you. You don't know him, Pearl whispered. No, I don't, Garrett acknowledged. But I know you. I know your strength, your courage. I know that you've survived everything he's done to you, that you've rebuilt your life not once but multiple times. Do you know how extraordinary that is? Pearl looked away, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze, the conviction in his voice. When I came back from the war, Garrett continued, I was lost, broken in ways that didn't show on the outside. I thought I'd never be whole again, never be worthy of happiness or peace. He moved closer, his voice softening. But I was wrong. We heal, Pearl. Not back to what we were before, but into something new, something stronger. And if we can't, Pearl asked, finally meeting his eyes, if some wounds are too deep, then we learn to live with the scars, Garrett said simply. We find people who don't see them as flaws but as proof of our survival. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her collar where it covered her scar. This doesn't define you. What he did doesn't define you. Only you get to decide who Pearl Lawson is and what she deserves from life. The tenderness in his touch, the truth in his words, broke something open inside Pearl. Tears spilled down her cheeks as years of fear and shame and anger poured out of her. Garrett gathered her into his arms, holding her as she wept, his strength supporting her when her own faltered. I'm so tired of being afraid, she confessed against his chest. I know, he murmured into her hair. I know, sweetheart. When her tears finally subsided, Pearl remained in the circle of his arms, feeling safer than she had in years. Garrett's heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, his breathing calm and even. Pearl, he said softly, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it. She looked up at him, vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be with anyone since before her marriage. I love you, Garrett said, the words simple and profound. Not because I want to save you or fix you, but because of who you are, brave and kind and stronger than you know. I love you and I want a future with you if you'll have me. Pearl stared at him, wonder replacing fear in her eyes. How can you be sure? You don't know everything about me, about my past. I know enough, Garrett replied. I know what matters. The rest you can tell me in your own time if you choose to, and if Derek comes, Pearl asked, the last of her defenses falling away. Then we face him together, Garrett said with quiet determination. And afterward, whatever happens, we go on together. Pearl reached up, touching his face with trembling fingers. I'm not sure I remember how to love, she admitted. It's been so long since I felt safe enough to try. Garrett turned his head, pressing a kiss to her palm. Then we'll figure it out together. No rush, no pressure. Just two people walking the same path. In that moment, with the setting sun painting the landscape in gold and crimson, Pearl made her choice. She would not run again. She would stand her ground, face her past, and perhaps, if she was brave enough, claim a future with this extraordinary man who saw not her damage but her strength. "I think," she said slowly, "I would like to try." Garrett's smile was like dawn breaking. He bent his head, hesitating just a breath away from her lips, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Pearl closed the distance between them, sealing their newfound understanding with a kiss that felt like coming home. The warning came 3 days later. Sarah's younger brother, who worked at the telegraph office, rode out to the ranch with news that a telegram had arrived for Vince Harmon from Denver. The boy hadn't seen the content, but the timing was suspicious. "They're coming," Pearl said, pacing the kitchen while Garrett and young Tommy Baxter watched. "Derek and Vince. They've made some kind of arrangement." Garrett nodded grimly. "Probably, but now we have the advantage of knowing." He sent Tommy back to town with messages, one for the sheriff, one for Clara, one for Matthew. Then he turned to Pearl, his expression serious but calm. "We have choices," he said. "We can go to town, seek protection from the sheriff. We can leave, head for the New Mexico territory or further west. Or we can stay here and face whatever comes." Pearl considered each option, weighing the risks and possibilities. Running again held no appeal. Seeking the sheriff's protection might work, but it would put others at risk if Derek was as determined as she feared. That left standing their ground. "We stay," she decided. "But I won't have you facing this alone. This is my fight." Garrett's eyes softened. "Our fight now, Pearl. That's what it means to love someone. Their battles become yours, their safety as important as your own." The simplicity of his declaration, the depth of commitment it represented, nearly undid Pearl. She stepped into his embrace, drawing strength from his solidity, his unwavering support. "Then we prepare," she said against his chest. "Together." Preparations were straightforward but thorough. Garrett cleaned and loaded every weapon on the ranch: his Winchester rifle, 2 revolvers, a shotgun, and Pearl's Derringer. They established signals and hiding places, alternate routes out of the house and off the property if retreat became necessary. Clara arrived the next day, bringing supplies and news from town. Vince had been seen buying ammunition and liquor, a dangerous combination. The stranger, presumably Derek, had checked out of the hotel but not left town. The sheriff was watching them both but could take no action without cause. "I'm staying," Clara announced, setting her carpetbag in the spare room. "You'll need another pair of eyes, and I'm a fair shot with a shotgun, as Vince can testify." Neither Pearl nor Garrett argued. Clara's practical competence and no-nonsense attitude were reassuring, and her presence gave Pearl a sense of having family standing with her, something she hadn't experienced since her parents' deaths years before. They settled into a watchful waiting pattern. Someone was always on lookout, monitoring the approaches to the ranch. Meals were prepared with an efficiency that allowed for quick abandonment if necessary. Weapons were kept close at hand. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part. Each passing hour wound Pearl's nerves tighter, each distant sound causing her to start. Yet beneath the fear was a new emotion: determination. She would not be a victim again. She would not allow Derek to destroy the life she was building, the love she was cautiously embracing with Garrett. "Tell me about Colorado," Garrett said on the second night as they sat on the porch watching the moonrise. Clara was inside, resting before her turn at watch. Pearl hesitated, then realized there was nothing to be gained from silence anymore. "I was 19, she began, naive and flattered by the attention of a handsome, successful man. Derek was 32, owned the largest cattle operation in the county, moved in the best circles in Denver society." She described their whirlwind courtship, the lavish wedding, the initial happiness that slowly gave way to control, subtle at first, Derek dictating her clothing choices, monitoring her friendships, restricting her movements. Then came the criticism, constant and wearing, undermining her confidence and isolating her further. "The first time he hit me was 8 months into our marriage," Pearl said, her voice steady now as she recounted the painful history. "I'd ordered a dress he deemed too fashionable, too likely to attract other men's attention. He apologized afterward, promised it would never happen again. I believed him. Garrett listened without interruption, his face compassionate but not pitying, his hand occasionally squeezing hers in silent support. It got worse, Pearl continued. More frequent, more violent. He was careful, though never where it would show when we were in public. And we were often in public, Derek playing the role of devoted husband, me the adoring wife. No one suspected. No one would have believed me if I'd told them. She told of her first escape attempt, how Derek had found her in Colorado Springs and brought her back, how the punishment had left her bedridden for days. How the second attempt had taken her to Denver, where she'd begun to build a new life until Derek tracked her down again. The scar, she said, touching her neck, was his promise that the next time would be my last. But it was also my wake-up call. I realized he would never stop, never let me go, so I planned more carefully, saved every penny, waited for my chance. When he went to Chicago on business, I disappeared. Changed my name back to my maiden name, Lawson, headed south instead of west as he would expect, kept moving, kept looking over my shoulder. When she finished, Garrett was silent for a long moment, then he raised their joined hands to his lips. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said simply. "For trusting me with you." Pearl felt a weight lift from her shoulders, the secret she'd carried for so long now shared and somehow lightened in the sharing. "Now you know everything," she said, "all the ugliness, all the weakness." "I see no weakness here," Garrett replied firmly. "Only courage and resilience, and nothing that changes how I feel about you." Pearl looked into his eyes, finding only truth there, and allowed herself to believe that perhaps a future was possible after all. That Derek hadn't destroyed her capacity for love, only buried it temporarily. "I think," she said slowly, testing the words, "I think I'm falling in love with you, Garrett O'Malley." His smile was radiant in the moonlight. "That's convenient," he replied, his voice teasing but his eyes serious, "because I'm definitely in love with you, Pearl Lawson." He leaned forward, kissing her with a gentleness that belied the strength she knew he possessed. Pearl responded, allowing herself to experience the moment fully, to feel desire and tenderness without fear for the first time in years. When they parted, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he promised, "we'll have time, all the time in the world." "I'll hold you to that," Pearl replied, allowing herself to believe in a future beyond the coming confrontation. They came at dawn on the third day. Pearl was in the kitchen preparing coffee when Clara's warning call came from the porch. 2 riders approaching from the east, moving steadily toward the ranch. Garrett was at Pearl's side instantly, rifle in hand. "Remember the plan," he said, his voice calm but alert. "If things go wrong, you get to the horses and ride west. Don't wait for us, don't look back." Pearl nodded, though they both knew she had no intention of leaving without him. She checked the derringer in her pocket, feeling its weight like an old, unhappy friend. "Clara, take position by the north window," Garrett directed. "Pearl, stay inside until we know what we're dealing with." Pearl watched from the window as Garrett stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. The approaching riders were clearer now, Vince Harmon on a sturdy roan, and beside him, immaculate despite the dust of the trail, Derek Lawson on a black thoroughbred that had likely cost more than most men earned in a year. The sight of her husband, after 3 years, sent a chill through Pearl's body. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a conventional way, perfectly groomed, his posture radiating arrogance and entitlement. The man who had systematically destroyed her confidence, her safety, her sense of self, but she wasn't the same woman he had terrorized in Colorado. She was stronger now, supported, loved, and she was done running. Pearl stepped onto the porch beside Garrett, ignoring his look of concern. If this confrontation was to happen, she would face it standing tall, not cowering inside. The riders stopped a cautious distance from the house. Vince was visibly nervous, shifting in his saddle, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. Derek, in contrast, appeared perfectly at ease, as if he were arriving for a social call rather than a confrontation. "Mr. O'Malley, I presume," Derek called, his voice as smooth and cultured as Pearl remembered. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I see no property of yours here, Mr. Lawson," Garrett replied evenly. Just my home and those I've invited into it. Derek's gaze shifted to Pearl, his expression softening into a parody of concern that once might have fooled her. "My dear wife," he said, "you've led me on quite a chase. 3 years is a long time to be separated from one's beloved spouse." Pearl felt Garrett tense beside her but was grateful when he remained silent, allowing her to respond as they had agreed. "I am not your wife, Derek," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Not in any way that matters. The woman you married no longer exists, you made sure of that." Derek's false smile hardened slightly. "Now, Pearl, there's no need for dramatics. Whatever disagreements we had can be resolved. I've come to take you home where you belong." "This is my home now," Pearl replied firmly. "With people who respect me, who see me as a person, not a possession." Derek's expression darkened. "I see you've been filling their heads with your hysterical fantasies. What did you tell them, Pearl? That I abused you, that I'm some kind of monster?" He looked at Garrett. "My wife has always had a vivid imagination, Mr. O'Malley, and a tendency toward nervous conditions that require firm guidance." Garrett's voice was deceptively calm when he spoke. "The only thing that's clear to me, Lawson, is that Pearl left you and doesn't wish to return. That's all I need to know." Derek's mask of civility slipped further. "She is my wife under the law. I have the right to reclaim what's mine." "She is not property," Garrett replied, his grip on the rifle tightening imperceptibly. "And she has made her choice. I suggest you respect it and leave peacefully." Derek laughed, a cold sound devoid of humor. "Or what, Cowboy? You'll shoot me for claiming my legal rights? I think not." He reached into his jacket, producing a folded document. "I have here a commitment order, signed by a judge in Denver. My wife is mentally unstable, in need of institutional care. Anything she's told you is the product of her delusion." Pearl gasped, genuine fear flooding through her for the first time since the confrontation began. This was a new tactic, one she hadn't anticipated. If Derek could convince authorities she was insane, he could lock her away forever, beyond the reach of help or justice. "That's a lie," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "There was no hearing, no examination. You can't just declare someone insane because they refuse to submit to your control." "Unfortunately for you, my dear, I have considerable influence with the judiciary in Colorado," Derek replied smoothly. "Now, this can proceed in one of two ways. You can come with me willingly, and I'll consider foregoing the institutional care in favor of domestic supervision, or you can resist, in which case I'll have no choice but to enforce the order as written." Vince, who had been watching the exchange with growing unease, spoke up. "You said nothing about committing her to an asylum, Lawson, just said she was your runaway wife." Derek gave him a dismissive glance. "You've been paid for your information, Harmon. Your part in this is concluded." Pearl felt the world narrowing, options disappearing. If Derek had indeed obtained such an order, fighting it would be nearly impossible. Her word against his, and he was a respected businessman with connections, while she was just a woman with a story too common to be believed. "Show me this order," Garrett said suddenly, his tone challenging. "Let me see the judge's signature, the court seal." Derek hesitated, a flicker of something uncertainty, fear, crossing his face. "It's not your concern, O'Malley. This is between me and my wife. If you're planning to forcibly remove someone from my property based on legal authority, I have every right to verify that authority," Garrett pressed. A tense silence fell. Pearl held her breath, watching Derek calculate his options. Finally, he refolded the paper without showing it. "I see my wife has been busy cultivating protectors," he said coldly, "but this changes nothing. She is coming with me today by choice or by force." As if on cue, movement in the distance caught Pearl's eye. Riders approaching from the south, at least 3 of them. Her heart sank. Derek had brought reinforcements, just as he'd done in Denver, but as the riders drew closer, a surge of hope replaced her despair. The lead rider was Sheriff Wilson, flanked by Matthew Baxter and another man Pearl didn't recognize. Derek noticed them too, his expression hardening further. "This is a private matter, not a spectacle for the entire territory," he snapped. "Seems to me," Garrett replied with quiet satisfaction, "it's about to become a matter for law enforcement." The sheriff and his companions drew up alongside the house, positioning themselves between Vince and Derek and the porch where Pearl and Garrett stood. "Morning, folks," Sheriff Wilson said casually, though his hand rested near his holstered revolver. "Having a conversation, are we?" "Sheriff," Garrett acknowledged with a nod. "Mr. Lawson here was just explaining how he intends to forcibly remove Miss Lawson from my property, supposedly on the authority of some commitment order from Colorado." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? May I see this order, Mr. Lawson?" Derek's jaw tightened. "This doesn't concern El Paso law enforcement, it's a Colorado matter." "Well now, that's where you're mistaken," the sheriff replied easily. "Anything that happens in my jurisdiction concerns me directly, especially when it involves threats against one of our citizens." "Citizens?" Derek scoffed. "She's been here, 2 months? She's a transient, a runaway, my legal wife." "Former wife," Matthew Baxter spoke up, producing a folded newspaper from his saddlebag, according to the records published in the Denver Post last year. He handed the paper to the sheriff, who scanned it before looking up at Derek with new understanding. "Says here you were granted a divorce in absentia when your wife couldn't be located, Mr. Lawson, on grounds of abandonment." Derek's face flushed with anger. "That was a legal formality, nothing more. A strategy my lawyers suggested to protect certain assets while the search continued. Seems to me," the sheriff said, "it makes Miss Lawson a free woman, legally speaking, no longer your wife, no longer subject to any authority you might claim over her." Pearl felt lightheaded with shock and relief. Derek had divorced her, she was legally free of him. The news was almost too wonderful to comprehend. Derek's composure cracked further. "This is absurd. I came for what's mine and I won't leave without her." "Actually, you will," Sheriff Wilson said, his casual tone hardening into authority. "Miss Lawson has made her wishes clear. She's staying. You're leaving, preferably headed back to Colorado, but I don't much care where as long as it's out of my jurisdiction." "And if I refuse?" Derek challenged. The sheriff smiled without humor. "Then I'll arrest you for trespassing, attempted kidnapping, and whatever other charges I can think of between here and the jailhouse. Your choice." For a moment, Pearl thought Derek might actually draw the pistol she knew he carried, might force a violent resolution. But calculation had always been his nature. He took risks only when the odds favored him overwhelmingly, and those odds had just shifted dramatically. "This isn't over," he said, looking directly at Pearl. "You think you've won, but you've only delayed the inevitable. I always collect what's owed to me." "The only thing owed here," Garrett said, stepping forward, "is an apology to the woman you've terrorized for years. But I don't expect a man like you to understand the concept of decency or remorse." Derek's gaze shifted to Garrett, hatred burning in his eyes. "Enjoy my leftovers, Cowboy. She may seem untouched now, but trust me, she's damaged goods, broken in ways you'll discover soon enough." Before anyone could respond to the vicious taunt, Pearl stepped forward, her head high, her voice steady. "I was damaged, Derek, by you, by your cruelty and control, but I'm not broken, I never was." She moved closer to Garrett, drawing strength from his presence. "What you see as damage, good men see as survival. What you tried to destroy in me has only grown stronger." She took Garrett's hand openly, a declaration of choice and trust. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, and I'm not running. This is where I belong, with people who value me, not for what I can be forced to give, but for who I am." Derek's face contorted with rage, but whatever he might have said or done was forestalled by the sheriff moving his horse between them. "I believe that concludes our business here," Sheriff Wilson said firmly. "Mr. Lawson, Mr. Harmon, I'll escort you back to town. You can collect your belongings and be on the afternoon stage. I don't expect to see either of you in El Paso again." For one tense moment, it seemed Derek might refuse. Then, with a final venomous glare at Pearl, he jerked his horse around and rode away without another word. Vince followed, clearly relieved to extract himself from the situation. The sheriff tipped his hat to Pearl and Garrett. "I'll make sure they leave town," he promised. "Matthew will stay here until I send word they're gone." As the sheriff followed Derek and Vince, Pearl felt her legs tremble, the aftermath of fear and tension weakening her. Garrett's arm came around her waist, supporting her. "It's over," he said softly. "He's gone," but Pearl knew better. "For now," she replied, watching Derek's retreating figure. "He won't give up so easily." "Then we'll be ready," Garrett assured her. "Together." Clara emerged from the house, shotgun still in hand. "Well," she said briskly, "that was quite a morning. I think we could all use some coffee." The simple, practical suggestion broke the remaining tension. Pearl laughed, a sound of genuine relief and growing joy. "Yes," she agreed, "coffee would be perfect." Later, after Matthew had departed with news that Derek and Vince had indeed boarded the stage under the sheriff's watchful eye, Pearl stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the landscape in gold and crimson. Garrett joined her, his arm slipping naturally around her waist. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Pearl leaned into his strength, allowing herself to fully appreciate the sense of safety and belonging she felt with him. "I'm thinking that, for the first time in years, I can look forward instead of constantly looking back." Garrett turned her gently to face him. "And what do you see when you look forward, Pearl Lawson?" She smiled, touching his face with newfound confidence. "I see possibilities, a home, work that matters, people who care about me." She took a deep breath. "And I see you if you still want me." Garrett's eyes darkened with emotion. "If I still want you?" "Pearl, I've wanted you since the moment I saw you struggling with that trunk in the rain, not just for your beauty, though God knows you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, but for your courage, your resilience, your kind heart that somehow survived everything that man tried to destroy." He took her hands in his. "I love you, Pearl. I want to build a life with you right here if that's what you want. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to see you smile without shadows in your eyes, hear you laugh without restraint." Tears filled Pearl's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I love you too, Garrett. More than I thought I could ever love again. You make me feel safe, but not because you protect me, because you believe I'm strong enough to stand beside you, not behind you." Garrett smiled, that sunrise smile that never failed to warm her heart. "Is that a yes, then, to a life together? To being my wife when you're ready?" "Yes," Pearl replied without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." His kiss was gentle yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, Pearl looked up at him with newfound peace. "He called me damaged goods," she said, not with shame but with simple acknowledgement of fact. Garrett brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And I see only a survivor," he replied. "The strongest, most courageous woman I've ever known, the woman I love exactly as she is." In that moment, as the last light of day gilded the world around them, Pearl knew she had finally found what she'd been searching for all along, not just safety or freedom from fear, but a place where she was valued for her whole self, scars and all. A place where love didn't demand perfection but embraced vulnerability as part of strength. A place called home. The wedding took place in October, when the desert bloomed in a brief, glorious display of wildflowers. It was a simple ceremony in El Paso's church, attended by the friends who had become Pearl's family. Clara standing proudly as her matron of honor, Sarah and Matthew with their infant son, the sheriff and his wife, and others who had welcomed her into their community. Pearl wore a dress of pale gold with no high collar to hide her scar. It was visible to anyone who cared to look, a mark of her past, but no longer a source of shame. Garrett's eyes had filled with tears when he saw her walking toward him down the aisle, not despite her scar but because of all it represented. Her survival, her courage, her journey to him. Their life together unfolded with a joy Pearl had never dared to imagine possible. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, Garrett's skill with horses complemented by Pearl's head for business. They expanded gradually, buying adjacent land, increasing their breeding stock, earning a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far away as California. Clara remained their dearest friend, eventually selling the mercantile to open a small hotel that quickly became known as the finest establishment between San Antonio and Santa Fe. Sarah and Matthew's newspaper thrived, their growing family a constant source of delight for Pearl, who found in Sarah the sister she'd never had. Vince Harmon never returned to El Paso. Rumor had it he'd headed to the silver mines of Nevada, still searching for easy wealth that always seemed to elude him. As for Derek, they heard news of him occasionally through Matthew's newspaper connections. He remarried within a year, a young heiress from a wealthy Denver family. Pearl felt only pity for the girl, hoping she would find the strength to leave before Derek destroyed her as he had tried to destroy Pearl. 2 years after their wedding, Pearl gave birth to a son they named Thomas, after Clara's late husband. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Grace. Watching Garrett with their children patient, loving, encouraging their independence while ensuring their safety healed something deep within Pearl that she hadn't even realized was still wounded. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home watching their children play in the yard, Pearl leaned against Garrett's shoulder. "Are you happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist, his voice still carrying that hint of concern that never quite disappeared, his desire to ensure her well-being a constant that never felt controlling. Pearl looked up at him, at the face she knew better than her own, the lines at his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the streaks of silver beginning to appear at his temples. "Completely," she replied honestly. "Are you?" Garrett's answer was to kiss her, a gesture that still held the same tenderness and passion as their first kiss on this very porch. "Beyond measure," he said when they parted. "You and the children, this land, this life we've built together, it's more than I ever dreamed possible." Pearl watched as Thomas chased a butterfly across the yard, his laughter mingling with Grace's delighted squeals. This was her legacy, not the pain Derek had inflicted, but the joy she and Garrett had created together. This was her victory, not just surviving, but thriving. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "for years I believed him when he called me damaged goods. I thought no one could ever truly love me, that I was somehow less worthy because of what I'd endured." Garrett's arm tightened around her. "And now?" Pearl smiled, a full, radiant expression that reflected the peace she had found. "Now I know better. The damage doesn't define me. It never did. It's what we do with our scars that matters, whether we hide them in shame or wear them as proof that we were stronger than whatever tried to break us." "You were always stronger," Garrett said, his voice rich with pride and love. "Always." As the sun set over their land, painting the world in gold and promise, Pearl leaned into her husband's embrace, surrounded by the life they had built together. She was no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. She was home.